Russia is now losing more soldiers per day on the battlefields of Ukraine than it can recruit to its military. Privyt! My name is Connor Klein. I'm an expert in international relations. I've been living in Ukraine for many years and speak Ukrainian and Russian. So I'm here to give you a more informed, nuanced, and unique perspective on the happenings of the Russo-Ukrainian war. So in the last week, Meduza, which is an independent outlet from Russia, not too many of those these days, so not affiliated with the government, they produced an investigation into compensation payments and sign-up bonuses with respect to the Russian military. Now, they used the data that's actually published by the Russian government, so we can kind of extrapolate from that these are the low watermarks in terms of recruitment and Russian soldiers being killed or injured or missing in action in the Russo-Ukrainian war. And what Meduza have found is that if you look at recruitment into the Russian military, it is now under huge pressure because it is a lot lower than it was 1 year ago. So if you think back to the autumn of 2022, Russia decided to launch a partial mobilization. So you're basically called up to the military. Apparently it was about 300,000 men were called up and they went and served. However, that led to a dramatic flight from Russia, in particular more productive young men who were from big cities. They tended to leave Russia. It was estimated over 1 million left the country. So not only did they take 300,000 men out of the workforce, or unemployment, I guess, if they were unemployed, but they took them out of the workforce primarily. They also lost another 1 million people, and in particular, people who were on average more productive towards the Russian economy. So Russia didn't want to repeat that. When they needed more soldiers, they decided instead to increase the incentives to join the Russian military. So, and obviously, you probably heard that they recruited heavily from prisons. There was the famous Prigozhin speech at a prison before he launched his mutiny, failed mutiny, and then was presumably killed. I guess that's the official version, is that he died later on. But basically, they heavily recruited from prisons. The Russian prison population has also been dramatically reduced. I'll make another video about that pretty soon. So with respect to incentives, they doubled, tripled the incentives to sign up and made it extremely attractive to the average Russian man. Is many multiples what you could expect to earn in a few years by signing up to the military, in particular if you end up being killed, because then your family would get these compensation payments, or if you were currently in debt, the sign-up bonus would possibly even pay that off for you. And they got a massive increase in the number of voluntary sign-ups to the military in 2023, in particular in the fourth quarter, where it seems that, at least the way the Russian government has framed it in their accounting, that they were possibly recruiting up to 70,000 men per month into the military, which is a big number. However, Meduza extrapolating out from those figures, which are, they have to make estimates based on when the Russian government increased different incentives, and that mightn't align exactly with the timeframes on the data that they were able to look at from the Russian government. However, they estimated it's probably only about 500 to 600 new soldiers signing up per month at the moment, which is per day at the moment, 500 to 600. So if you extrapolate that out for a month, that's probably be about 15, 16, 17,000 per month. And that is obviously a huge drop off from 2023 towards the end. And that is in spite of Russia increasing the financial incentives even further in the meantime. So it seems that their runway in terms of, or the effectiveness of increasing salaries even further, is not encouraging that many more Russians to sign up for the military. This is now a growing problem, because if you look at the compensation payments, and you have to also remember that the Russian government has an incentive not to classify soldiers as killed in action if possible, because then they can defer paying out the families of the bereaved for possibly many years, or possibly they'll never have to pay them if they're always officially missing in action. Of course, later on, you can take a case after someone is missing for many years to have them legally presumed as dead. So when they looked at those figures, they estimate that the current casualties are between 600 and 750 Russians per day. However, this is almost certainly massively underestimated. The Ukrainian figures, especially in the last few months, indicate that Russia is losing almost 2,000 or even more than 2,000 soldiers per day on the battlefield. That includes killed in action, wounded in action, and missing in action. So possibly those figures are inflated. Obviously, Ukrainians have an incentive to claim that Russia is losing more soldiers than it really is. However, the Ukrainian figures correlate pretty well with previous data from the US and British governments that release what they think the losses are in the Russian military. So possibly it is not wildly inflated, and in fact, Russia is losing way more than 600 to 750 soldiers per day. Probably is almost certainly well over 1,000. And if they're only able to recruit 500 to 600 per day, then you have a significant shortfall. So this is a massive crisis in manpower if Russia continues to prosecute the war at the same intensity. They, of course, can look for solutions. One would be to increase salaries even further, but that doesn't seem to be having a great impact. Secondly, they can get foreigners to join the military. North Korea has sent apparently 13,000 soldiers to fight against Ukraine, and there's speculation that will then basically increase to 100,000. So you could say they're going to send maybe even 10,000 per month. That would definitely make up a considerable amount of the shortfall that Russia is currently suffering from. And of course, they can go and do another mobilization, something they have been trying to avoid repeating since they mobilized in the autumn of 2022. I was actually in Kazakhstan during the autumn of 2022, and there were so many Russians, in particular Russian men, who had came to the country trying to get a hotel or an apartment, short-term stay. The prices basically more than doubled. So not only was I affected by the war directly with the Russian rockets and the invasions when I'm in Ukraine itself, when I go to Kazakhstan, I end up paying double for my accommodation, thanks to the internal politics of Russia and the fact that they are fighting this war against Ukraine. So didn't put me in the best mood, that having to pay even more and seeing lots of Russians around, although these are the Russians who were trying to avoid being sent to the war, presumably. So they could go for another mobilization. That is one option. It's one they've been trying to avoid. This will have big ramifications internally for the Russian economy. As I've said in many other videos, there are three problems that Russia needs to solve in 2025 in order to continue to prosecute the war at this intensity. One is manpower. We're obviously I'm discussing that in this video. The second is money. And if they continue to raise the salaries, that obviously is biting into their finances. Their economy is on an extreme strain. They're spending around 40% of their national budget on defense, ironically called Defense 3, offense, and internal security, and materiel, because even though they're getting helped a lot by Iran or North Korea, respect to that, and China to a certain extent, they are burning through their Soviet-era stockpiles that they tend to refurbish, and they will face shortages of certain ornaments in 2025 unless they find solutions to that. So I'll leave you one final thought, that is, at the moment, the Russian economy, many people say it's stagflation. That doesn't seem to be the case to me, because they actually have quite high employment. They are not suffering from unemployment. What has happened is that, well, partly because a lot of men left the country or are fighting in the military, that actually they have an issue with getting enough workers, and salaries have actually increased in Russia as a result, even though the economy is suffering greatly and is in a very perilous situation. So in 2025, we could see, we're expecting to see a lot more economic problems in Russia. The potential real estate bubble that might burst. They have the currency that's dropped a lot and may drop dramatically further in 2025, and they're burning through their sovereign wealth fund, so they may hit a massive economic crisis sometime in 2025. If that happens, ironically, Russian men and maybe even Russian women would have an even bigger incentive to sign up for the military if those salaries are going higher and higher, and suddenly there is a big crisis that leads to unemployment and real stagnation in the economy, stagflation with very high inflation, economic decline, and high unemployment. That actually would encourage a lot more Russians to go and sign up for the military as a way out of economic issues. So they may end up solving one of the issues, ironically, by increasing another, which is the money. So we'll see what happens in 2025, and in particular, if Russia decides to continue to invest so heavily in fighting this war after the inauguration of Donald Trump, which is in about 5 weeks' time. It hasn't been a good week for Russia. They obviously abandoned their ally Assad in Syria. His regime collapsed yesterday after being propped up by Russia for many years. So Russia is having to make decisions about where to invest its resources, and it will be interesting to see if they decide to continue with this intensity after January 2025. So I'll leave it at that for today's video, and see you in the next one. Do побачення.